Could you imagine a world without geese, without cars, without even paved roads? A world where stepping outside your village meant risking everything? What if you were a woman, journeying across vast wild lands in 740, at a time when life itself was a daily gamble? Number 5. Exposure to the unforgiving world and the scarcity of safe harbor. Imagine the year 740. Add the air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, clings to a woman's cloak as she steps onto a path barely more than a deer trail winding through an ancient forest. Her destination, perhaps a distant market, a relative's dwelling in another village, or even a pilgrimage site, lies days, perhaps weeks away. The very ground beneath her worn leather shoes is an uneven tapestry of compacted dirt, loose stones, and treacherous roots offering no smooth passage. Unlike the bustling, relatively safer thoroughfares of later centuries, travelways in the early medieval period were rudimentary at best, often disappearing into stretches of trackless wilderness or becoming boggy quagmires after even a moderate rain. The absence of proper infrastructure meant that each mile covered was an arduous undertaking, fraught with physical demands that tested the endurance of even the most robust travelers. For a woman often burdened by societal expectations of physical fragility, or perhaps genuinely less accustomed to the rigors of long-distance trekking due to her typical roles within the homestead, this physical strain was magnified. Every step was a battle against fatigue, against the insidious creep of cold that seeped into her bones as the sun dipped below the horizon, or the oppressive heat that made her vision swim during the day. The most immediate and persistent danger arising from this primitive landscape was the sheer brutal force of the elements. In 740, and there was no dependable weather forecast, no quick detour to a climate-controlled rest stop. A sudden torrential downpour could turn a navigable path into a muddy river, sweeping away smaller travelers or trapping them in deep, viscous mire. Icy winds in the northern climes, even outside of deep winter, could strip away warmth, leading to hypothermia in a matter of hours if adequate shelter was not found. Blistering summer sun could cause dehydration and sunstroke, particularly as water sources were often scarce and of questionable purity. For a traveling woman, whose clothing might have been designed more for modesty and societal norms than for practical resilience against extreme weather, these conditions were especially perilous. The heavy wool tunic and cloak, while offering some protection, could become waterlogged and impossibly heavy in a storm, clinging to the body and chilling it profoundly. The risk of frostbite, heat, exhaustion, or severe dehydration was not merely uncomfortable, it was a genuine threat to life. Beyond the immediate meteorological threats, the scarcity of safe and appropriate shelter presented a formidable challenge. In 740, inns as we understand them today were rare outside of major urban centers or along very specific well-traveled pilgrimage routes. Most travelers relied on the hospitality of monasteries, isolated farmsteads, or charitable individuals. For a lone woman or a small group of women, seeking such hospitality was a double-edged sword. While it might offer respite from the elements and a place to rest, it also exposed her to the unpredictable whims and intentions of strangers. A respectable woman of the era would be highly constrained by societal expectations regarding her interactions with men outside of her family or known community. To seek lodging in a common room where men might also be sleeping was often deemed inappropriate, risking her reputation and inviting unwanted attention or even assault. This societal constraint often forced women into more perilous alternatives, sleeping outdoors, exposed to wild animals, or finding precarious shelter in caves or under dense foliage, always at the mercy of the elements and unseen predators. Imagine, if you will, a young woman named Elara journeying from a Saxon village to visit an ailing aunt in a neighboring shire. A sudden violent thunderstorm erupts, turning the forest floor into a swamp. Her simple wooden clogs are useless against the deep mud. She finds a partial overhang of rock, but the wind whips through, bringing the rain with it. She shivers uncontrollably, her teeth chattering, her hands numb. She has no tent, no sleeping bag, only her sodden clothes and cloak. The night stretches on, seemingly endless, filled with the howls of wolves and the cracking of thunder. Her body aches, her muscles cramp, and she fears not only the cold, but the creatures lurking just beyond the sparse light of her tiny, flickering tinder lamp. Such an ordeal was not a rare occurrence, but a very real possibility for any woman embarking on a journey. Prolonged exposure, even if not immediately fatal, could weaken the body, making it susceptible to illness, a topic we will delve into further. The lack of proper rest and nutrition further compounded these dangers, leaving travelers physically and mentally drained, less able to respond to new threats. Furthermore, the very act of seeking and preparing food and water in the wilderness carried its own inherent dangers. While some travelers might carry a small store of dried meat or hardtack, fresh provisions were often necessary. This meant foraging, hunting, or relying on chance encounters with villages. For women who might not possess the skills or tools for hunting, foraging was often the only option. However, without extensive knowledge of local flora, the risk of consuming poisonous berries or roots was significant. Water sources, often stagnant ponds or shallow streams, were rarely pure, serving as breeding grounds for disease. The act of gathering firewood, away from the immediate vicinity of a temporary camp, exposed one to the risks of encountering wild animals or human predators. The need for privacy, especially for essential bodily functions, forced women further away from any perceived safety, making them vulnerable. A woman needing to relieve herself would have to find seclusion, often stepping into dense undergrowth away from her traveling companions, making her an easier target for lurking dangers, both animal and human. The simple reality was that the land itself, beautiful and vast, was an indifferent and often hostile entity, demanding constant vigilance and offering little comfort or security to the unprepared or poorly provisioned traveler. Number 4. The crippling scourge of sickness and the bleak absence of care. In 740, and even without the immediate threat of a bandit's blade or the fury of a storm, a woman's life on the road was constantly shadowed by an invisible yet ubiquitous killer: disease. Medical understanding was rudimentary, bordering on superstition, and effective treatments for most common ailments were simply non-existent. For anyone traveling, sanitation was a foreign concept. Food preservation was primitive, and clean water was a luxury. These conditions created a perfect storm for the rapid spread and devastating impact of illness, turning a simple journey into a potentially fatal odyssey. For women, however, the dangers of sickness were often amplified by their unique biological realities and societal constraints. Consider the pervasive threat of gastrointestinal illnesses, often brought on by contaminated food and water. A traveler might stop at a roadside well, seemingly fresh, yet unknowingly drawing water polluted by animal waste or human effluent from an upstream village. A piece of dried meat kept too long might harbor unseen bacteria. Dysentery, characterized by severe diarrhea, abdominal pain, and dehydration, was a common and terrifying affliction. For a woman whose physical reserves might already be strained by the rigors of travel and whose diet might have been less robust than that of her male counterparts, the rapid onset of dehydration could quickly become life-threatening. Imagine a woman doubled over in agony by the side of a track far from any settlement. Her companions, if she had any, could offer little more than comfort. There were no rehydration salts, no antibiotics, no intravenous fluids. Her body would simply waste away, her strength failing, her life ebbing with each agonizing spasm. The lack of privacy during such an affliction, the sheer indignity and vulnerability of it, added another layer of suffering to an already desperate situation. Beyond the immediate threat of foodborne and waterborne illnesses, respiratory infections were rampant. Common colds could quickly escalate into deadly pneumonias in a weakened body, especially after nights spent exposed to the elements. Measles, smallpox, and influenza, all highly contagious and often fatal, swept through communities with terrifying speed, leaving trails of devastation. A woman encountering an infected person in a crowded market or sharing a cramped communal sleeping space in a rudimentary shelter ran a high risk of contracting these virulent diseases. Once symptoms appeared, often a fever, and body aches, her journey would grind to a halt. To continue traveling in such a state would be impossible. To stay put meant relying on the kindness of strangers, often impoverished themselves and fearing contagion. A woman perhaps nursing a child would face an even greater burden, as the illness could be passed to her infant, whose tiny body was even less equipped to fight it off. The sheer terror of waking with the telltale rash of smallpox, knowing what it meant for her chances of survival, let alone for her appearance or ability to continue her journey, was a psychological burden almost as heavy as the physical one. Childbirth on the road represented perhaps the most profound and unique medical danger for traveling women. In 740, a childbirth was inherently risky even in the relative safety of one's home. Surrounded by experienced women, infant and maternal mortality rates were tragically high. But imagine a woman going into labor far from any village, without the aid of a midwife, without clean clothes, without even a warm private place to deliver. The journey itself, with its physical shocks and stresses, could prematurely induce labor or cause complications. A rough jolt on a cart, a misstep on a treacherous path, could precipitate the onset of contractions. Without skilled assistance, the risk of hemorrhage, infection, or a difficult presentation of the baby increased exponentially. A prolonged labor could exhaust the mother to the point of death. If the child survived, the sheer logistical challenge of caring for a newborn while continuing a journey, all while the mother recovered from the physical trauma of birth, was immense. Cold, the hunger, the lack of proper hygiene, the constant fear of attracting attention from predators, all these factors conspired to make roadside childbirth a grim lottery where the odds were overwhelmingly against survival for both mother and child. Furthermore, any injury sustained during travel, a twisted ankle on an uneven path, a deep gash from a fall, or a severe bite from an animal, could become a death sentence. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics. A simple wound, if not meticulously cleaned, a near impossibility on the road, could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene or sepsis. A broken bone, if not set correctly, could result in permanent disfigurement or disability, making continued travel and self-sufficiency impossible. Without proper medical tools or knowledge, crude attempts at healing often did more harm than good. The grim reality was that once illness or serious injury struck, a woman's prospects for survival dwindled rapidly. There were no emergency services, no hospitals, and very few, if any, trained healers outside of monastic communities or major centers, and even those were often limited in their efficacy. A woman's only hope might be the desperate prayer that she could reach a settlement before the darkness of fever or infection claimed her entirely. A fragile hope, often cruelly extinguished on the lonely, unyielding paths of early medieval Europe. Number 3. The menacing shadow of reputational ruin and crushing social isolation. For a woman traveling in 740, some of the most insidious dangers were not those that left physical wounds, but those that attacked her social standing, her very right to exist within the fabric of her community. In a world defined by tight-knit communities, hierarchical social structures, and patriarchal norms, a woman's reputation was her most valuable and often her only asset. To lose it was to lose everything: her family's protection, her eligibility for marriage, her right to work, her place in society, and ultimately, her means of survival. traveling alone, or in the company of unchaperoned men, was an immediate red flag, casting a long, damaging shadow over her character and inviting a cascade of catastrophic consequences. The fundamental societal expectation for a woman in this era was to be chaste, modest, and under the protection and authority of a male relative, a father, brother, husband, or guardian. Any deviation from this norm, especially traveling without a legitimate, recognized male escort, instantly branded her as suspect. She might be perceived as a runaway, a vagrant, a harlot, or worse, a woman of ill repute, with no ties or honor. This perception, whether accurate or not, immediately stripped her of the informal protections and courtesies that societal norms might otherwise afford her. In villages, she might be met with suspicion, shunned, or even outright hostility. Doors that might open to a weary male traveler would remain barred to her. The fear of being associated with a loose woman, or simply the fear of the unknown, meant that charitable hospitality, a crucial lifeline for travelers, would often be denied. Imagine a woman, tired and hungry, knocking on the door of a distant farmstead, only to have it slammed in her face because her unescorted presence was deemed an ill omen or a threat to the family's own reputation. Consequences of this social isolation were not merely emotional or psychological. They were profoundly practical and life-threatening. Without a reputable connection or the assumed protection of a male, a woman would find it nearly impossible to secure a safe lodging, even if she had meager coin. Inns, often rowdy and male-dominated spaces, would be dangerous for an unchaperoned woman, where she might be preyed upon or robbed without recourse. Even if she found a place to sleep, the persistent whispers and judgmental stares would be a constant torment. More critically, access to food and water could be denied. In many communities, trade and charity were extended based on trust and social standing. A woman without a discernible, honorable place in society would struggle to buy provisions, to sell any small goods she carried, or to find temporary work to sustain herself. Starvation, therefore, became a very real and present danger. A slow, agonizing death brought on not by a lack of resources in the world, but by her forced exclusion from them. Furthermore, a damaged reputation left a woman utterly defenseless against exploitation. If she was perceived as an outcast, she became an easy target for men seeking to take advantage of her vulnerability, whether for forced labor, sexual exploitation, or theft. She had no one to appeal to, no family to defend her honor, no legal standing that would be respected. The law, such as it was primarily concerned with property and male familial rights. A woman outside of these traditional structures was largely invisible to it. A woman who was sexually assaulted while traveling alone might find herself blamed for the attack. Her reputation further sullied, making it impossible for her to return to her previous life, even if she survived. Such a harrowing experience would leave her with deep psychological scars, making trust impossible and further cementing her isolation. She would be trapped in a vicious cycle where her perceived lack of honor justified further mistreatment, stripping her of her dignity and self-worth. Consider the narrative of a young woman named Isolde, perhaps fleeing a forced marriage or seeking refuge after her family was lost to war or famine. She travels alone, a profound act of desperation. In each new village, her unescorted presence attracts suspicion. She is denied lodging, accused of being a vagrant or a witch. Children point at her, men leer, women turn their backs. She sleeps in ditches, foraging for scraps, constantly moving, trying to outrun the whispers and the hungry looks. Her clothes grow tattered, her face gaunt, further confirming the grim perceptions of her. Eventually, weakened by hunger and constant fear, she might succumb to illness or fall victim to those who see her as a convenient, disposable target. The social ostracism is not a mere inconvenience. It is a profound and active force that can push a woman to the very brink of survival, effectively ensuring her demise through a slow erosion of all support systems. The danger of reputational ruin in 740 AD was a silent, insidious threat, far more pervasive and ultimately just as deadly as any physical assault, slowly suffocating a woman's very existence. Number 2. The brutal reality of banditry and the ever-present threat of violence. The roads and paths of 740, and if one could even call many of them roads, were not merely challenging because of their poor condition or the harshness of nature. They were wild, unregulated spaces, territories where the rule of law was weak, if it existed at all. This made them prime hunting grounds for bandits, outlaws, and desperate individuals, turning every journey into a terrifying gamble. While men certainly faced the threat of robbery and violence, a woman on the road encountered a distinctly amplified and often more horrific spectrum of dangers. Her vulnerability was not just about the loss of her possessions. It extended to her bodily autonomy, her freedom, and ultimately, her life. Banditry in 740 AD was a widespread phenomenon, fueled by various societal conditions. Famines could drive desperate peasants to prey on travelers. Discharged soldiers, loyalties shattered after failed campaigns or collapsed empires, might turn to brigandage. Organized gangs, often operating with impunity in remote forests or mountain passes, specialized in ambushing unsuspecting travelers. These groups saw travelers as walking repositories of wealth, coinage, valuable trade goods, even decent clothing. The very isolation of the travel routes meant that help was far away and swift justice almost non-existent. Cry for help would likely go unheard, or if heard, ignored by those who feared becoming victims themselves. This environment of lawlessness meant that any journey, no matter how short, was undertaken with an inherent sense of dread, a constant scanning of the tree line, a heightened awareness of every rustle in the undergrowth. For women, the encounter with bandits escalated rapidly, beyond mere robbery. While a male traveler might be relieved of his purse and left beaten by the roadside, a woman faced the additional and often more terrifying prospect of sexual assault. This was not merely a side effect of banditry. It was often an explicit aim. In a society where women were often viewed as property, their bodies were seen as commodities to be taken, used, and discarded. The act of sexual violence was a devastating assault, not only on her physical self, but on her honor and reputation, rendering her spoiled in the eyes of her community, a topic we explored previously. Such an attack could make returning home, or continuing her journey with any semblance of normalcy, an almost impossible feat, often leading to social ostracism or even suicide, in a world where a woman's worth was so tied to her purity. Beyond immediate sexual violence, women were also at extreme risk of kidnapping. A man might be robbed and released, but a woman represented a more valuable prize. She could be held for ransom, particularly if she appeared to be of higher social standing, or sold into slavery, a fate that will be discussed in further detail. She could be forced into marriage or concubinage, her will utterly subjugated, her identity erased. A woman's beauty, her youth, her skill in certain crafts, all could make her an attractive target for capture. Imagine a young woman, perhaps on her way to join a convent, seized by a band of rough men. Her pleas are ignored, her struggles futile. She is dragged into the wilderness, tied up her future abruptly, and violently ripped from her hands, replaced by a horrifying uncertainty. Her journey is not merely interrupted, it is utterly redefined, turning her from a traveler into a captive, her ultimate fate grim and often short-lived. The methods used by bandits were often brutal. Ambush was common, turning a quiet stretch of road into a scene of terror in an instant. They might set traps, or simply emerge from the shadows, overwhelming their victims with numbers and weapons. Resistance for a lone woman, or even a small group, was often futile, and could provoke greater violence. Carrying weapons for self-defense, while perhaps an option for men, was rarely so for women in 740 AD, who were generally not trained in combat and whose societal roles did not typically include bearing arms. Her only hope in such a confrontation was often passive resistance or a desperate plea, neither of which carried much weight against hardened criminals. The psychological toll of living under such a constant threat cannot be overstated. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant shadow, every unfamiliar sound on the road would send a jolt of ice-cold fear through a woman's body, transforming the simple act of journeying into an unrelenting gauntlet of terror and hypervigilance where the potential for a violent, life-altering encounter lay hidden around every bend. The grim reality was that for many women, the road was not merely a path to a destination, but a perilous arena where their very existence was perpetually challenged by the cruel and unpredictable hand of human malevolence. Number 1. The horrifying bondage of kidnapping and the grim fate of slavery. Among the myriad dangers lurking on the paths of 740, at the absolute nadir, the most profound loss of agency and humanity a traveling woman could face was the terror of kidnapping and the subsequent descent into slavery. This was not a rare, isolated incident, but a pervasive and deeply entrenched danger, a grim constant in a world where human beings were considered commodities bought and sold like livestock or goods. For women, this threat was uniquely potent and carried a particular set of horrifying implications that often stripped them of their identity, their dignity, and any hope of return to a recognizable life. The socio-political landscape of 740 AD was fragmented and volatile. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted with every conflict, and raids between different groups were commonplace. In places where the Byzantine Empire met the burgeoning Umayyad Caliphate, or where Norse raiders ventured into Anglo-Saxon lands, or along the vast porous frontiers of nascent kingdoms, kidnapping was a strategic and economic tool. It was not just random bandits, organized slavers, often working with raiders or desperate local lords, actively sought out vulnerable populations. Women, viewed as valuable for their reproductive potential, their domestic skills, or their appeal as concubines, were prime targets. A male captive might be ransomed or pressed into military service, but a woman often faced a far more permanent and brutal fate. The act of kidnapping itself was a violent rupture. A woman, perhaps traveling with her family or a small group, could be seized during a raid on a village or an ambush on a remote road. The horror of being dragged away, leaving behind loved ones, hearing their cries or witnessing their deaths, would be an unimaginable psychological trauma. Her journey, which began with some purpose, however mundane, would be abruptly and violently rerouted into a nightmare. She would be bound, often roughly, and forced to march for days or weeks, enduring unimaginable hardships. There would be little food, less water, and no regard for her physical or mental state. Constant fear of what awaited her at the end of the journey, combined with the brutal physical demands of forced marching, often led to collapse, disease, or death along the way. Those who survived this initial ordeal would arrive at a slave market, utterly dehumanized and broken. Once a woman entered the horrifying world of the slave market, her fate was sealed. She would be stripped of her identity, her name, her past. Her body would be inspected, her potential for labor or pleasure assessed. She could be sold to perform back-breaking agricultural work, to serve as a domestic servant in a wealthy household, or, most terrifyingly, to become a concubine or a victim of sexual exploitation. In some cultures, female slaves were valued for their beauty and their ability to bear children, often destined for harems or forced into childbearing roles to produce more slaves for their masters. Her life would no longer be her own. Every aspect of it, from when she ate to where she slept to what she wore, would be dictated by the arbitrary whims of her owner. She could be resold multiple times, each new owner bringing new uncertainties and new cruelties. The psychological devastation of slavery was immense. The loss of freedom, the constant fear of violence, the crushing loneliness of being utterly separated from her family and culture, the forced cultural assimilation. These were burdens that few could endure without succumbing. Many enslaved women died from disease, malnutrition, overwork, or abuse. Those who survived often lived lives of quiet desperation, their spirits slowly eroded by their grim reality. There was virtually no recourse for an enslaved woman in 740 AD. Legal systems offered no protection, and escape was incredibly difficult, if not impossible, in unfamiliar lands and without resources. Her very existence was often forgotten by her original community, making rescue or return an almost mythical hope. Consider the story of Elara, a young woman traveling across the Frankish lands, perhaps seeking a new life after her village was ravaged by disease. She is captured by a raiding party and dragged eastward, across mountains and rivers. Her cries fade into the wind. She endures starvation, beatings, and the constant threat of assault. She witnesses other captives die along the way. Eventually, she arrives at a bustling market in a land whose language she does not understand, whose customs are alien. She is sold, her meager possessions stripped from her. Her new life is one of endless toil, serving a master who views her as nothing more than property. Her dreams, her aspirations, her very personhood are systematically dismantled, replaced by a harrowing existence of forced servitude. This, then, was the ultimate terror for a traveling woman in 740 AD. Not just the risk of death, but the far more insidious danger of a life utterly stolen, transformed into an unending nightmare of bondage, a fate from which there was almost no escape.